Greetings, and to all the synagogues who are watching us out there. I've known Joe and Anya for a number of years, and it's a pleasure to be here moderating between them. One thing was left out in the introduction, which is that they're married. I was called up just a few days ago to do this, and obviously they felt they needed someone to be between them, although I'm not. We're very lucky to have Anya here because in promoting her book, Global Muckraking, she's been a global traveler. She's talked about it in Istanbul, Malaysia, Budapest, Oxford, London, Johannesburg, Sao Paulo, and Washington. And this will be her first real talk in New York about it. And Anya is usually great in getting back to me when I send her emails, and if there's any delay, it's usually coming back. Oh, I'm sorry, we're in India. We just had dinner with the finance minister, and I just couldn't get back to you till now. So, and Joe, most of you will know about his exploits and the many books that he has written. For me, he really rose in my estimation when a few weeks ago I was watching Jeopardy, and he was the subject of a question, and that has always been one of my goals in life. And anybody who actually gets there is great for me. So excitedly, when I saw him, I said, Joe, you're on Jeopardy. He went, that's great. What's Jeopardy? So that's why he's able to write as many books as he has. He's not watching shows like that. So we're going to talk for about 40 minutes and then go to questions. You all have been given cards. And we're going to be focusing on Anya's book, but weaving in questions, Joe, also about journalism around the world, but also the issues that are covered in the press and how well the news media are doing on some of the key issues of our day and what we can learn from it and what's not being done. So I want to start with Anya. I was on a panel with her, or at a conference that she sponsored based on her book. So she brought all these people from around the world who, there are 47 articles in it that she has collected going back 100 years or so, examples of investigative journalism. And she brought many of the either contributors or people who wrote introductions to the examples that she gave there. And it covers everything from the subjects fishing, mining, sweatshops, slavery, corruption, dams, famines, massacres, genital mutilation, and sex slaves. So here's somebody who's read 100 years worth, ferreted out the best of investigative journalism over a century around the world. So Anya, I know that you also looked at what we can learn from it in terms of today. So what were the main lessons that you took away from this?
Well, it was really interesting reading 100 years worth of journalism. I spent time in libraries in Calcutta and in Delhi and in the British Library, and I had researchers all over the place. So I think one thing is that when you read 100 years worth of newspapers, you start to feel very cheerful about journalism today. I think that the way we consume information has really changed, and I think there's so much good reporting that's happening right now. So that was the first thing that I didn't expect. One thing I think when you read a lot of histories, you become a bit of a history bore. So one thing that kept surprising me was how so many of the stories that we think of as new, or the techniques that we think of as new, have been written about over and over again. So I was really surprised to find out that in 1906, there was a boycott of Cadbury's chocolate because the supply chain, the workers in Sao Tome and Principe were being very much exploited. And the Cadbury Company, they were abolitionists, they were Quakers, they fought against slavery, didn't know whether or not to cut off their suppliers. So it's a very modern dilemma, sort of like we've seen with Nike in the 1980s or Foxconn and Apple today. So one thing that surprised me was how the same themes keep coming up. I remember one day I was in Calcutta at the library reading a little article about the traffic jams on the bridge because of all the horse and carriages. It was a wintry January day and the newspapers were crumbling in my hands. They haven't been digitized. And I left the library and took a taxi and got stuck in a traffic jam on the same bridge. Only it was cars instead of horse and carriages. So I think the same themes keep coming up all over the world, which makes us think about when does journalism make a difference. The newspapers from the 19th century are in many ways very personal. They're almost like blogs. There's a lot of one guy with a printing press who gets letters from friends and contributors and posts a lot of sort of random information. So that was very modern. I think another thing that was really interesting was the same questions came up all the time about advertising and censorship. So the similarities really struck me. Another thing that surprised me was we always hear, oh golly, the New York Times doesn't have enough foreign correspondents anymore. If you really want to know about Philippine workers in Dubai, you've got to read a report from Human Rights Watch. Can't count on the newspapers anymore. And I think what surprised me was finding that the relationships between the advocates and the NGOs and the journalists were strong and go back really 100 years. Many of what we think of as the enormous stories, very often there were campaigners and NGOs that were helping the journalists get sources and get information. The journalists still had to go out and verify, and that was very difficult for them, of course, in those days, because getting to the places where the exploitation was happening was hard. It took a long time to find out what was going on, but those relationships were still there, and that was interesting to me as well.
Well, I know you also have you've talked about in your book, and you've studied, like, when do investigations have an impact? And you've talked about the role that advocacy and movements often have, because some of the cases, all the information will just lie there and nothing will happen. In other cases, things do happen. Sometimes it takes a long time. So what did you learn about that?
Well, I think Joe can speak to the economic research that's been done on this topic, but clearly in order for journalism to have an impact, there has to be someone who can be ashamed or pressured in some way. And it could either be the big corporation or the big government that's being exposed, or maybe somebody in government who's willing to change the laws after it happens. So I think the first thing is you've got to have someone that cares enough about their reputation and is willing to act. I think in general, journalism has to be repeated. One story about something bad doesn't really make a difference historically. And there have to be other groups in society that are ready to make a change. Anthony Appiah's book, The Honor Code, looks at the question of foot binding. There were people in China that wrote about foot binding for 800 years. But it was only when, he argues that there was only when there was an elite in society that was ashamed and wanted to make a change, and all of a sudden all the decrees against foot binding took place in over 6 months, and all of a sudden the practice ended pretty much. Trafficking is another example. There's a Bengali journalist called Dwarkanath Ganguly, and in the 19th century he was writing about trafficking of people. This is obviously a very contemporary problem that people still write about. He got traction because there was enough reformist Hindus in Bengal who wanted to see Hinduism modernized. They were campaigning against dowry, against wife burning, and they were also campaigning against trafficking of people. So that's critical. There have to be people that are ready to change.
Well, you mentioned the frequency. At the conference you had, I cited an example that I think is a good one, where the sheer frequency of a reporter doggedly following a story had an effect was Alan Schwartz of the New York Times, who wrote about head injuries in football. And this began, I don't know, about 3 years ago or so, and he just, it was not on, nobody was talking about it. And if he had written 1 or 2 or even 3 articles, I don't think that much would have happened. But in fact, he just, the Times let him keep going at it. And he put that story on the map, and now, of course, it's reached the point where mothers and fathers are worried about their kids playing soccer and doing headers. So do you feel, Anya, your book is all about, it's global, and you specifically looked outside the US. What do you think about the state of investigative journalism in the country today? Do you think with all the problems that the news business is facing that it's taken a big hit, or are you still encouraged by what you see being done?
Well, I think it's very hard to generalize. So clearly local newspapers are really understaffed and are doing less investigative local reporting than before. And some of the local news sites are going under, the online sites that people were so hopeful about. But we still have great investigative reporting in some of the classic places like the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune and the LA Times, of course. And then we have all these new entrants into the world of news. So places like the Overseas Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, the Global Journalism Investigative Network, ProPublica, the Center for Public Integrity, which just did that wonderful piece by Leslie Wayne about tax evasion or tax avoidance that was being facilitated through Luxembourg and affected, as many of our largest American companies have been using Luxembourg as a way to sort of channel their profits and not pay taxes, including FedEx. So I think globally we're seeing more investigative reporting at the moment, really because of 5 reasons. New media is connecting journalists who were isolated before and are now able to get together and do cross-border investigations. So your kind of lonely Cameroonian reporter who couldn't get to the place where the mining was taking place can now team up with the journalists somewhere else. Maybe those reporters in poorer countries, they're younger, they're less experienced. Maybe they don't know how to read SEC filings or profit and loss statements, but they can team up with journalists who do. So I think that's crucial. Clearly there's more data available online than there was before. There's media philanthropy, which right now is going strong. Everywhere we travel, we meet some millionaire who's funding a magazine, whether it's in Brazil or Australia. Don't know how long it will last. Sadly, the layoffs of older and more senior journalists means there's a lot of fantastic talent and institutional memory, so journalists are able to team up with younger reporters and help them. And then I would argue that on balance, the move towards democracy in so many countries has really helped as well. Joe Simon, the director of CPJ, Committee to Protect Journalists, which you co-founded, just published a new book on internet censorship. And he's really discouraged. He talks about the new democratators, the leaders of Ecuador, Turkey, countries where they're elected, these leaders are elected, and then they turn against the media. So they're sort of a combination of democratically elected and authoritarian. But I guess I'm more of a glass half full person. And what I see is that a lot of the democratic transitions have had a knock-on effect. So the Arab Spring, for example, even though it's obviously turned very disappointing, made countries like Singapore sit up and take notice, and their press is much freer than it was 20 years ago. Malaysia now has all kinds of alternative blogs that they didn't have 20 years ago. Vietnam and China, we're seeing all this pressure from social media. So on balance, I'd say I'm feeling good right now about what's going on around the world.
Wow, I'm encouraged. I didn't know there's so much doom and gloom in our business that I'm glad to hear that there's so much activity. Well, Joe, let me bring you in at this point, talking about investigative journalism around the world. Given your own, ability to people you meet and your own investigations of what goes on in the world of economics and finance and so on, are there areas that you feel are they're not looked at as well as they should? I mean, do you feel in terms of the financial sector in the world or the banks that, gee, there's this low-hanging fruit there, or some digging that really we could be learning a lot more?
Well, I think there are actually lots of examples where you go around and you hear a story of some government that's twisting some other government's arm for a bad purpose. I think it's difficult. There's so many of these stories that it's difficult to make a judgment about which of these to pursue. And I think that's one of the problems. And it's very difficult, some of the stories that I would hear, it'd be very difficult for a journalist to go up and get the story very easily.
What's an example?
Oh, well, a lot of these have to do with areas that I've been working in. But one example, and it's really, very different from the kind of investigative journalism that you're talking about, but there's a real need in Asia for infrastructure. And there's not sufficient money in the poorer countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and they desperately need money. And the World Bank needs to be recapitalized. There was an agreement to recapitalize it, and same thing for the IMF. And the U.S. Congress won't pass that. So that's all well known. But what's not so well known is that China's made a very generous offer to create an Asian investment fund to help these countries finance their investment. And the United States is going around and twisting arms for these countries not to join. Now, obviously, the countries whose arms are being twisted and giving in are not talking about it because they don't want to embarrass themselves and saying, look, the U.S. government just forced us not to join. And the governments that did join want to keep a low profile. So it's the kind of story you won't get except if you're talking, sort of in the back room with a finance minister.
Well, Joe, let me play devil's advocate because if that type of thing is going on, that is not a sort of like behind the closed door passing of money. That's a political thing that people like you know about it, and you, if a journalist came to you, would probably be willing to, at the very least, guide them. So what do you think? This plays into my own supposition I've recently got on this whole kick about how the U.S. coverage of China very much mirrors U.S. interest. The coverage in the New York Times, they've almost become, they do very good investigative reporting on wealth and inequality in China, but at the same time, I'm just struck by how much they often reflect the position in Washington. So I wonder if that's an inhibitor of journalists from looking, because that is a good...
Very much so.
So.
And I've written about that, that inevitably, and this is one of the difficulties of investigative journalism in general, is the problem of sources. Now, talks about that in her book. You need sources, and particularly say in business journalism, there are certain sources that are easy to get, and you certainly don't want to offend them. And that helps shape the news.
So the access question, people are afraid of burning their sources. This has been going on in journalism for so long. It's a very big problem.
And in the area of business and economics, it's obviously a very serious problem because the people who have the information usually have a particular perspective that they want to get out there.
And an ability to withhold information or hurt a journalist if they do not play. I was doing some looking into how the press was covering the financial collapse, and I talked to a Wall Street Journal reporter who had been covering Lehman Brothers, and I was reading a book in which it turned out that she had written something that the executive of Lehman Brothers didn't want out, and so who was it? Richard Fuld, is that the person? Yeah. So he was so angry that he cut her out for weeks, and I read about how all these her colleagues on Wall Street, reporting on Wall Street, would say, "Gee, how you doing? They've cut you out at Lehman Brothers." That was her beat. And she said, and so I called her up. I said, "Gee, what was this like, And so she told me that it actually was a good thing because she was not able to rely on the sources at the bank. They weren't giving her information. She had to go out and talk to other people. And I'm thinking, took that for you to give you the prod to do that? But on Wall Street, a lot of reporting is basically people are beholden to the people they're covering. Now, in the wake of the financial collapse, I wonder to what degree you feel that the reporting, those types of things have changed, and that we do have now more aggressive reporting on the banks. Goldman Sachs at one point was sort of off limits to everybody, and then they became fair game. I'm wondering if you feel now if we're getting good aggressive reporting on Wall Street.
Maybe a little better in certain areas. As you say, some people that were off limits are now okay, but in other areas, I find it often striking. Anya mentioned, for instance, the issue of the American corporations that were not paying their full share, you might say, not fair share, but any share of their taxes, and were using, say, Luxembourg. That was a really good investigative journalism story. Quite remarkable how long it took for that to get exposed. And take one example, Apple was called upon to testify in Congress about its use of what is called the double Irish, which is a way of avoiding taxes. And the reporting afterwards was very much like he defended it, what they had done. And it was a very, what I thought, very pro-Apple issue. You know, take a case where these two issues, the public and the private interface, there's an issue now of a confirmation of an appointee of somebody who was involved in the inversions, which were these ideas where American companies convert themselves into a foreign company in order to avoid taxes. And the question is, does it make sense to have a senior government official in charge of the financial sector be one of the people who was facilitating this? And I think there's serious questions.
You're talking about the current debate over
Yes.
Weiss?
Yeah.
Yeah. Somebody, Alan Ross Sorkin, did a very big defense of him. So.
Although I think
That's exactly the
Yeah.
kind of.
So is that, yeah, you thought that was an example of somebody who's sort of beholden to.
Yeah.
But I think one thing, though, that has changed is there's lots more about inequality now in the media, and lots more articles about how austerity has been a bad idea for Europe. And I think that's shifted. I do think the press coverage has shifted a lot since the start of the financial crisis.
I wanted to talk about that. It's obviously
Yeah.
a big issue. And in doing my very short research for tonight, Anya pointed me to something that I really was surprised to find, which was that the whole idea of the 1% was really floated by Joe, correct, in an article in Vanity Fair.
A usual academic publication.
Well, it shows how a good editor, the article in Vanity Fair, which appeared May 2001, Colin Murphy, as Anya was telling me, came up with the title, Of the 1%, By the 1%, For the 1%. And that's where the whole idea of the 1% sort of originated, which is sort of amazing, and the power of the press and of Joe's own conceptualizing. So here's an example. I mean, Anya's talking about something has to be written about over and over again. So 1%'s been written about over and over again. So we have had some good reporting. How much has changed? How much has all this reporting actually led? I mean, and if not much, why?
Well, obviously it's changed much less than I would have hoped. I think what's changed more than anything else is public awareness of the issue. And I view that like a lot of the other things that Anya was talking about. If you don't have the information, if you don't know about these issues, it's very hard to change. So the idea that trickle-down economics, if we grow, everybody is going to do well, that was an idea that was widely accepted. And it was the basis of the notion, you might say the pro-growth strategies. The fact that we've had growth, but most Americans have not shared in that growth. That in the middle, income is lower than it was a quarter century ago. Those kinds of facts really change one's perception about the nature of our economy and how successful. Now, the next question is, how do you get the change? If you don't have that awareness, you're not going to get it. What I guess I found so striking is how resistant our political system is to some of these changes. Take something where now we know, over 75% of Americans believe that we ought to increase the minimum wage from the $7 and some cents. And probably in New York, everybody thinks that. And yet we can't get it through Congress. And that says something about our political system. And the belief in democracy is that if you keep repeating these, and that's where repeat them long enough, then eventually some of these things will change.
Well, the people have talked about, like, in trying to figure out, this is sort of an aside, what happened in the recent election that, you know, was such a Republican landslide, and yet all these minimum wage measures passed. So, like, what was going on there? But I looked at some of the polling data, and, you know, on the big question of the role of government and the amount of taxation that there should be, people are still very, in this country, I think, reluctant to endorse expansion there.
Well, that's part of the conflicting narrative. So most people, I think, understand that things aren't going very well. You know, if you ask most American, I just saw some data today, you know, it's 56% or so of Americans, and this was on the eve of the election, expected their real income adjusted for inflation to go down. 33% said it was going to stay the same, and very few were expecting an improvement. So overall, most Americans are not thinking the economy is delivering for them. But then if you sort of think about what's going to solve it, I think they've been sold this view that the government is not going to be the solution. Right. So there's this tension here. They don't know what the solution is. One of the you know, this is really getting off the press, but for the press, the media is one of the ways in which people form their views of, is the government successful or not? And that depends to some extent on the nature of the coverage. If you're covering the failures more often than your successes, you get a very different view. And you know, we get the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Financial Times every morning. And I find it very interesting reading the same story in the three different newspapers, and particularly the headlines. And the same story will be described as a failure in one newspaper. The government does something, and it'll be described as a failure. Only X% of the population has signed up, say, for Medicare, for the new healthcare program. And the other newspaper will say, sign-ups exceed expectations. And, you know, same event, and the way it gets characterized can be very, very different, reinforcing preconceptions.
Of those three papers, do you have a preference for one of them?
It's not because they're sponsoring this, but I do like the Financial Times. But, you know, it's partly because a lot of my focus is on international.
Okay.
They do have a fantastic international coverage.
Let's talk about the role of the internet in both economic change, but also in what's going on in the news media. So Anya, you've done all this research around the world, and you know, the internet clearly has been a major factor, as you mentioned, in a lot of the reporting going on now. And I'm curious, I'm struck a little bit by the differences abroad, particularly in countries that don't have well-established news infrastructure for news, and often government controls, versus, say, in America, where we have so many freedoms in established places. So how would do you have a sense of how the internet, the role it's played in terms of whether it's been good or bad for journalism abroad versus the United States?
Well, I think in many countries, the internet has allowed journalists to publish things that they couldn't otherwise publish. So, for example, in Vietnam, you have journalists who work for state-owned media who by day know all kinds of things that they really can't say in a government-run newspaper, and then at night they can go home and blog under a different name, and they do. So in many places, more information is getting out on the web than would be in official media. Then there's other countries like Russia, which you probably know more about than I do, where there are kind of alternative websites, but no one's actually reading them or paying attention to them, and they have very small following. But all in all, because it's so cheap to have a website, there's many, many countries around the world where there's just way more information coming out online.
And in America, do you feel, you mentioned a number of websites, but do you feel the internet has been used by journalists in a way that they can or should?
Absolutely. I mean, there's unlimited room on the internet. So again, if you want to read the Luxembourg story, which is really long, if you go online, it's all there. So yes, there's lots of long, well-reported information out there, and then there's lots of short, superficial stuff as well. There's so many. I mean, Flipboard, Circa, BuzzFeed, Vice. I try to read as much as I can, and it's overwhelming. It's wonderful.
Do you think BuzzFeed is worth reading?
Parts of it, yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm not really a fan of the sort of clickbait headlines and the native. I mean, another way that America is turning into Africa is the fact that there's so much native advertising now and paid for content. And this has traditionally been a terrible problem in developing countries, that you could get almost anything published if you paid someone to publish it. And now we're seeing that here, which is really too bad, I think.
One country where the internet, you can see the internet having effect on the political life was Italy, where the Berlusconi controlled 3 of the television stations. 3 of them were controlled by the government, which he controlled. And the newspapers were, a lot of them controlled by particular interest. Pepe Grillo organized this what is the name of the movement? Anyway, this huge movement that got about 20% of the votes. And it was done mostly through the internet. And it was also interesting, one of the successes there was a lot of investigative journalism, because he exposed a lot of the corruption. You know, he would post how many of the members of the parliament had engaged in one kind of form of corruption or another. So it really it served a very effective way of disseminating that kind of information.
I'm a little more of a glass half empty person on this question than Anya. I have a bunch of websites that I bookmark and go to, and mostly news oriented. And you know, the big term in the Silicon Valley world is disruption. How everything is, you know, disrupting existing models, and certainly if you take Uber and Amazon and so on, it's been true. But if you look at sort of how much disruption these news websites have done in terms of really creating, forcing people to look at the world in a new way, and doing things like the concussion story I mentioned, or some of the investigations Anya mentioned, I'm just not sure that I've seen so much there. And I think, you know, even the good, the very high quality sites like ProPublica are a little bit still locked in old ways of doing things, and haven't really used the web in the way that it could. There's this new initiative by Piero Miglior, some of you might know about, with Glenn Greenwald, that we're waiting to see if it will deliver something, but there's all kinds of disruption going on within that institution.
But again, I think like the 19th century, what a lot of these websites do is give you lots of information that's very personal on one subject. So for example, anybody that has anything bad to say about Uber can now go online and write ad nauseum about it. I was reading something the other day that was an article online, I can't remember if it was Pandos Daily, about how 3 different people had cab drivers that, you know, punched them. And this was a news story, in depth, online, about Uber. And again, it was really like the 19th century. This would never have made the New York Times. There wasn't enough information, but one person with a bee in their bonnet can just write at length. So I agree, it may not be the kind of fantastic, detailed, professional, fact-checking project that takes years, but if you care about one thing, there's a lot of people who are probably, not always, but often writing about it in great detail.
Well, clearly on things like the Michael Brown incident, Trayvon Martin, or sexual assaults, like people can get information out on things, whereas before they might have been locked out. So I do think on that level, but in terms of like tax evasion and whatnot, that's a very good example of what we need more of. I know that you two have different opinions about how we might fund more journalism on the web, so I'd like to explore that. Joe, I know what's your favorite option for what should be done there?
Well, I think there's some role for what I call the public option. That basically, my view is that information is a public good. This is one of the problems investigative journalism or information, which more generally is that it's different from the production of steel or a table or other. If one person knows that information and disseminates it to somebody else, it doesn't subtract from the first person. And there's a real public good of managing the public good, of getting this information out. And the question, privately, there'll be an undersupply. And historically, we've funded investigative journalism or information more generally in this accidental model by advertising. you know, some by subscription, but a lot by advertising. And without any necessarily clear connection between the advertiser and the news being produced. And we hope there's not too close of a connection. That would taint, create a conflict of interest. So once you recognize that information is a public good and from which we can all benefit, it makes some sense that that ought to be something that the government ought to support. And one always worries about government tainting the information, and you know, but we can create institutions. Other countries have succeeded in creating relatively independent institutions that can monitor the potential conflicts that would arise. And a few countries have actually made some progress in that direction.
Well, given the current political realities in America, on a scale of 1 to 100, where would you place the likelihood that something like that might come about here?
More on the one side.
The 1%.
Yeah, I mean, France gave young people newspaper subscriptions. The Scandinavians will support the second largest newspaper in every small town so that they get a diversity of opinions. The BBC and licensing fees. I mean, there's lots of ways you could support the media, but of course in this country we officially don't like to do it, even though of course we had those postal subsidies for such a long time.
Well, so another approach is philanthropy.
Well, now we're seeing a lot of philanthropy, as I mentioned earlier. I'll be curious to see how long it lasts. Traditionally, I guess philanthropy was often used to do things like support community radio in South America or in Africa, or journalism training programs around the world, or transition, helping journalism schools change. And the philanthropy has often been done by governments, especially in Europe and the United States. So it often followed the sort of our geopolitical objective. So after the war in Afghanistan, a lot of money was put into helping Afghan journalists. After the Iraq War, we put money into Iraq. China's now spending lots of money in Africa. I think it was Mauritius, where we visited the brand new TV station that the Chinese had paid for. And they're also bringing journalists to China, African journalists.
Well, how many of the stories that you have in your collection were like a rich guy or gal saying, I'm giving you money to journalists to...
You know, as far as I know, none. More what we had in the book was sort of an idealistic lone journalist who got fed up and set up their own outlet. For example, Carlos Cardozo, the Mozambique reporter, had worked in the official government media and got so disappointed by the corruption after the revolution and how decayed it got that he quit and he started a little fax newsletter. And he ended up being killed under mysterious circumstances. Or Benjamin Saldana Roca was so appalled by the conditions being meted out to the indigenous workers who were gathering rubber for the London-listed Amazon Rubber Company in the late 19th century that he set up a little newspaper called La Sanction. And he campaigned and he wrote about how terrible the company was for years. And then no one, of course, in London had any idea until 2 American engineers were traveling down the Amazon and they visited Iquitos, Peru, where he lived. And one of them, Walter Hardenberg, became Benjamin Saldana Roca's son's English teacher. And then they found out what was happening and they read the newspaper and they brought the news back to London. So that was something that came up a lot in the book. One person set up a newspaper, a little newsletter, to campaign against something terrible that they saw. And they did it for years, and eventually the news got back. And very often these people weren't even journalists, and they didn't stay journalists, but the journalism made an impact eventually.
Well, that sounds very much like the internet today. Somebody can start up a site.
Yeah, what I always say the difference with today is news travels faster now, but it's often ignored when it arrives.
Well, one thing that people have not paid as much attention to is that with this huge flowering on the web and so much information available, the fragmentation of the audience has been a very negative force in terms of actually making things change. Because when you have a story on the front page of the New York Times, everybody sees it, the networks run it, and you can have the same information appear on one of these sites. There was a great example recently, the New York Times. Did anybody see that they ran the sort of classic recipe of different Thanksgiving recipes of 50 different states?
Sure.
Did you hear about what happened? In Minnesota, they had something called a grape pecan sour cream cooked pie. And
Sounds delicious.
not only does it sound bad, but in Minnesota, people were appalled. They said, nobody ever has cooked this in the state. And like, they got 10,000 comments in the New York Times. And the public editor had to take up the story and talk to the cooking editor and like, where did this come from? And do an apology to the state of Minnesota. So
I think it sounds delicious. I know you
well,
don't like
Anya,
sweets.
Maybe you will try it and we can
I
do
do.
it. So you know, in the Woodward Bernstein era, American investigative reporting was the model of the world. How is American journalism regarded now? Is it still sort of, do people still look up to it?
I think so, but I think that journalism standards are really different around the world. I think that the idea of sort of American impartiality and objectivity, I think journalists in a lot of developing countries feel that they want to help their countries develop, and often they want to support their governments. As you say, there's often it's nationalism, but I think it's also a feeling that they can help by taking a stance. So again, journalists that I've met in somewhere like Sierra Leone or Ghana who are writing about mining, they feel their governments are getting ripped off by foreign companies and they really want to help them. So I think in that sense there are sort of big cultural differences with the kind of journalism that people often aspire to here. I think that our focus in the US on new technology and data, I've been to lots of conferences with journalists from developing countries where people from the New York Times or Google come and show all the wonderful things that they're doing and all the databases that you can search, and that's not always as so relevant to journalists in different countries. So I think there are very different standards around the world and aspirations around the world. On the other hand, I think that the culture of journalism is very global, it's very globalized. So I think all journalists like to think that they're kind of changing the world and helping by the work they do. And again, because you co-founded the Committee to Protect Journalists, you know so much about that.
We got some questions here. Let me ask two quick things. Joe, are there any particular columnists that you gravitate to that you like to read, or any that you push aside and don't like to read?
Well, I'm an economist, so there are two economics journalists who I think are fantastic, Paul Krugman and Martin Wolf. And I do read, I don't say I agree with everything they say, but I think that quality of economic journalism is really high. And there are a few other economic journalists, Floyd Norris, Gretchen Morgenstern uncovering some of the problems in the corporate world. They're actually, and FT has a number of journalists that I think are actually quite good as well. There are a lot of individual articles that written by other people that I find very, very difficult. When you see a journalist that we described have been captured by his source, one example, there were a number of articles written about the Amazon story and trying to defend Amazon. I thought Paul Krugman had the best article explaining why this was an abuse of market power. It was just sort of elementary economics, but the way Amazon had been successful in selling their version to a number of columnists was really quite surprising to me.
Are you talking about in the controversy with Hachette?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because there was a lot of negative reporting. Amazon got a lot of negative reporting.
Oh, there was a lot of negative reporting, but in terms of
Understanding what
of what the economics
Yeah.
was, that there was a view that said, what is anybody complaining about? They're succeeding in getting down the price to consumers.
Mm-hmm.
So that was sort of a naive misunderstanding of our antitrust laws.
Okay.
So there was this view, well, antitrust laws, aren't they to protect consumers? If they're getting the price down to consumers, doesn't that mean that there's no problem? But actually, there are a number of problems that Paul pointed out in his article.
Okay. Are there any journalists or columnists who you just generally groan when you read their stuff?
Yes, but we might not name names.
No, don't interrupt.
Oh, sorry.
I was trying to, the point is I don't, I groan so much that I block their names right now.
That's diplomatic.
Yeah.
How about you, Anya? Is there anyone in particular, anyone else who on the web who you've found to be a voice of fresh views? It's hard on the spot. If you maybe think about it for a minute.
Okay, thank you.
I thought I'd just ask a marital question. Do you all, when you go to the movies, do you generally agree or not?
Yes.
You said you just saw.
We just saw The Imitation Game.
So did you agree on that?
Yes.
The Alan
Yep.
Turing.
Actually, another one that sort of related to this was we saw the Snowden movie.
Yep,
Citizen
Citizen
4.
4.
I was going to ask about that.
And that was one where investigative journalism was very much part of that whole story. And I thought it was, a very interesting way of you might say, a compliment to the media, to the journalism. So you're reading all these stories and you are inevitably interested in the person behind it. And the media, the journalism gives you a little bit of a feeling, but there's nothing as effective as actually seeing the person I don't say in person, but in a film.
But also it's another case where more information doesn't necessarily do anything, right? I mean,
You think
now,
that's true?
well, Snowden's raised awareness, but have we seen that many legal changes? I suppose the Brazilian internet law that was passed last.
What happened with Angela
that-
Merkel, pushback, from the Europeans about it. So. But you might be right about America, that there's been much
Brazil
less.
did get this pretty good internet law through that enshrines net neutrality and does try to protect privacy. So I guess that was a good result from Snowden.
And it certainly made it more difficult for an expansion. And it certainly focused a lot of attention on the extent of eavesdropping. So at the very least, when I get emails now, a lot of them begin when they're talking something confidential just between you, me, and the NSA.
Well, the one area that really is booming is documentaries. While for some reason, I don't know why, but there's just an explosion. People are able now with the new digital technology to film on very low budgets. And unfortunately, I think the 1% term applies well to how many of them ultimately break through and actually break new ground and do it in an effective way. But it is interesting that it's in an area where there's even a very good investigative journalism going on.
Yeah, another example that we saw a couple years ago was called American Casino, and it was an investigative journalism, but in the form of a film of some aspects of the mortgage scandal, where it actually, brought home very effectively, I thought, the extent to which the financial sector had engaged in predatory lending and a whole set of other abuses. And in a way, I mean, there's now investigative documentaries that when you read it in print, well, when you read it as an economist in terms of statistics, that's one thing. Good journalism always has stories that convert those statistics into real life that has a bigger impact. But I often think when I see it in a film, it really has an even more of an emotional impact.
Inside Job was another one. Which
Exactly.
talked about at Columbia, your own department, the way that
We only had two professors at Columbia. Inside Job was about how the economists were part of the problem in the financial sector, and conflicts of interest were rife. And Columbia and Harvard often are competitors, but this was one case where Harvard had 3 stars of people who were really bad, and we only had 2.
And it did cause a change.
Yes,
There's
it
much more
did.
disclosure.
Yes. Whether in the long run the disclosure makes a difference is a question, but you're absolutely right. All right, we've got some questions here. I think we've actually covered a number of them in the course of our talk. One here is, how truthfully does the press cover Israel? I think we're going to pass on that. Partly just because we could have a whole session on that. I have, and they're very strong views, and maybe the 92nd Street Y will invite us back or others to talk about that, because we could have a good discussion. One thing that somebody's brought up, which is slightly tangential, but in terms of the press is a very interesting question, and the Bill Cosby matter. Given how long that information was out there, going back, I mean, minimally the mid-2000s, when I think it was 2006, a big story appeared, I don't remember where, by one of the people who said that she had been a victim of this. So why, did it take so long for this story to really become what it has? Biography came out, 500-page biography of Cosby, which got well received, but it just did not have anything about this. The journalist decided it would be he said, she said, so he left it out. I don't know if any of you have, it's a little bit off our topic.
Well, I mean, I guess it reminds me of the NFL story that you were just talking about, which is there can be, I don't want to say, rumors or news that isn't covered for a very long time, and then something happens. Clearly, biographies are very often going to omit information if the person writing them needs to have a relationship with the subject.
If the subject's still alive.
Yeah, I mean, that's why like the V.S. Naipaul biography was so incredibly surprising. It was authorized, and then the writer talked about V.S. Naipaul cheating on his wife and having an affair while his wife was dying of cancer, and that got so much press attention because it was so unusual. So I think biographies often aren't necessarily the places where we're going to get kind of inside scoop on people. I think that this is definitely one of the advantages to social media, is that it does make it possible for stories that have been abandoned or buried to suddenly resurface and to really go viral. So I would say in a way it's a victory for social media.
Yeah, I mean, the general point is that it often takes a long time, and often is the second coming of the story. Another example of that was Grasso and the New York Stock Exchange scandal.
His salary on the...
his salary, and the fraction of the revenues in the New York Stock Exchange that were going to him. I think it was the Wall Street Journal that first covered it, and then it just died, and then the FT picked it up. Yep. And this is, there are speculations about the advantage of having a foreign press, which is less beholden to some of the same sources or the same environment. And so they picked up the story, and they repeated it several days in a row.
On the front page.
On the front page, and then he resigned. It was a really interesting example of the second coming.
But of course, with the Cosby thing, there's a lot going on, and just in terms of the whole issue now of sexual assault is suddenly, it's almost like the society has to catch up with the reality for it to happen. I mean, same-sex marriage is another example. Boy, I don't know if any of you have followed this, but the whole story in Rolling Stone about the University of Virginia, the gang rape case. Now there are questions about whether the reporter actually, how much independently the reporter corroborated the story. So, gee, we're still hearing more, but that's another example of one story that got pushed aside. Here's another question that Joe's addressed to you, which is not really about the press, and we've touched on it, but I don't know, I think people might want to hear it. So how do you, as an award-winning economist, solve the problem of the U.S. shrinking middle class and poverty gap? So if you would like to tell us if you were Treasury Secretary or going back to your old job in the Council of Economic Advisors.
Well, let me make just a couple comments. First, I think it's a very serious problem. We were just looking today at a conference at some of the data which basically say over the last 10, 15 years, almost all the growth that has occurred in the country has gone to the top 10%. So it's actually not the bottom half that hasn't participated, it's the bottom 90%. That's a dramatic change in our society and our economy. So I think it is a first order importance, and not just a question of poverty. It's the majority of our citizens that something's wrong with our economy. And that leads to the second point. I don't think it's going to be minor changes. I think those minor changes are important, but I don't think they're going to be enough. What I mean by minor changes are things like raising the minimum wage. I think it's extraordinarily important. I think the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, more progressive taxation, a fair tax system that would tax capital gains at the same rate that somebody who works as a plumber got taxed. So I think there are lots of reforms that we need to do that would make a difference. But the more I look at the way our economy and our society has evolved, the more convinced I am that while these will make a difference, there's a more fundamental problem. And the more fundamental problem has to do with, you might say, the functioning both of our economy and our political system. So it's the way our financial system, it's the degree of monopolies, it's our education system, bankruptcy laws. It's a more wholesale re-examination of how the American economy and our American society, because it includes education and our financial system, how all this works together.
Okay.
It is related, I think, to the media issue, the press issue, because I think there's not been as much coverage as I think on this debate that is beginning to come about, yes, now there's an understanding that there's been this huge increase in inequality.
And that trickle-down doesn't work.
And that trickle-down doesn't work. But the question is, will these kinds of minor adjustments, and they're more than minor, solve the problem, or is there something really more fundamental wrong with the way our economy and our society is functioning? It's a big question, and obviously a lot of people don't want this question to be addressed.
Well, it's interesting. This does get to a very interesting press question, which came up at the conference I mentioned that Anya had around her book, which is the nature of investigative reporting. Is it too narrow? The types of things that we deal with are often abuses, corruption, human rights abuses, very clear things, environmental disasters where there are payoffs and stuff. But the bigger issue of exploring what's going on in our country, and in some ways getting beyond just exposing a problem or inequality, but what are possible solutions? I mean, now we're getting beyond the realm of investigative journalism, but you could have much more on imagine if the New York Times took their approach to concussions in the NFL and did it on how do we get America going again? And for instance, I know your Vanity Fair article, the big issue of infrastructure in America. I mean, what would happen if we suddenly decided to repair not only our roads and bridges, but our schools and ports and so on, and the job creation that would do. But of course, you need tax money to do that, and so on and so forth. So yes, I think it's interesting that you think the press could play a big role in, and you don't think that's being done now as well as it should be.
And this goes back to the point you made. The press needs normally hooks to write the story. There's an event, and that makes it salient. It gives it a currency. These are longer-term trends. There's no single event. There are particular events, a bridge falls down and then people start talking, why in the United States do we have an infrastructure that is so far behind that in other countries? But they often, they'll talk about it for a couple of days in a connection with the collapse of the bridge. They won't ask the bigger picture, which is, why are we spending a smaller fraction of our GDP on infrastructure? So that's not an event,
Right.
That's a trend. And it's hard to write about trends.
Yeah, I was going to say, we actually did a study of press coverage of the Economic Stimulus Act, and basically the press was focused on would it pass or wouldn't it pass, and not really that much on what do we need and what would be the best policy. 6 months after the American Recovery Act, there was some press coverage looking at specific infrastructure spending, but I think daily journalism, or now minutely journalism, lends itself to sort of episodic coverage, and it is harder for people to do those long, big picture stories, right?
Yeah,
Actually,
and
go
let
ahead.
me just say, and one of the things, this goes back to the sources, they tend to talk to people in the financial community and not to academic economists, or they'll talk to administration.
Right.
But after that stimulus, say 6 months later, there was a lot of discussion, the economy's not back to full employment.
Mm-hmm.
The stimulus failed. If they talked to most economists, they would have said, that's not the way things happen. It's going to, it was a very deep shock, that the question is, it's going to take a long time to get back to full employment. And the relevant question is, where would we be, where would we have been in the absence of this stimulus? It may not have brought us back to full employment, but we're still much better off than we would have been in the absence.
Yeah, I've actually been struck, one thing that does, even Paul Krugman, I've been frustrated that he doesn't mention the role of full employment in this country. If we had full employment, the effect on wages, it seemed to me, would be very dramatic, which happened during the Clinton period. So that seems to me too something that would be a solution. That
it is the major, one of the major causes of our current malaise in terms of both it's one of the reasons why there's so much inequality. Wages remain stagnant now
because employers don't have to pay more to hire labor. Yeah.
It's a slack labor market, even though the official unemployment rate has come down. It's a slack labor market. But it's also the case that if we had full employment, we would have so many more resources that we could use for a whole variety of uses.
Right. Paul Krugman is always saying, he's going on and on about why people are sticking to the narrative that we still need to cut our budget and our deficit, and when it's been so disproved. And I think, well, it serves the interest of business and corporations to not have full employment because it keeps their labor costs low. Anyway, that's something that I've observed. Now we have a question from Longboat Key, Florida. Please comment on the consequences of journalists creating the news against reporting it. Do they ever just report it? Now this question, I think, reflects a body of opinion that probably a number of people listening in, they might go, my God, you're talking about journalists doing this and that, and changing the debate, and why don't they just report on what's going on? And that is, a school of thought. We obviously, in our discussion, are working on a different hypothesis about the role of the press. I don't know if you want to address this question.
Well, I think lots of people try to create news or manufacture news or stage news events. So I'm not sure that journalists do it more than anybody else. What do you think, Michael?
I think that this question does reflect a school of thought, which is that people get uncomfortable with the press. They feel they have their own agenda. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm sure the person who wrote in about Israel feels that way. Yeah. And that can be argued from both sides. When I watch Fox News, I think, my God, they create all these things. They take these stories that really seem to be completely phony and blow them up. But I'm sure conservatives reading the New York Times feel the same way. And maybe the NFL thinking, why are you writing about concussions? You know, you're just creating a story. So I don't know.
But you have to admit, you know, the Snowden story, the whole set of Snowden stories about the NSA engaged in intelligence activities, that was real. And, you know, basically there's been at least enough confirmation to say that wasn't made up. Those were real stories that we didn't know about, and that in the absence of that kind of investigative journalism, we would not have known about. The same thing, you know, in the case of the tax story that Anya mentioned, where it was, you know, what was made this very salient was Luxembourg has become the center for tax avoidance, and the person who was just elected head of the European Union was the person who was the prime minister of Luxembourg in this period where all this bad behavior was going on. People sort of suspected that this was going on, so it wasn't that there were, it was sort of, there were rumors about this going on, but not until they actually documented and wrote the story did one really understand the magnitude of the extent of tax evasion and the number of, quote, respectable companies. You know, it was one thing for Apple and Google to be involved, and we sort of expect that of these very clever companies. But to realize that
Coach handbags, FedEx.
that it was just really pervasive.
Well, this is our premise then, is that investigative reporting is, I mean, it's uncovering, it's exposing, it's raking muck. And the premise of our panel, I think, is that this is a good function of the press. But there are people out there who, you know, think, just report the news, but then you get caught up, like during the financial crisis. That reporter I mentioned, the Wall Street Journal, was just taking information from Lehman Brothers, and that's not necessarily the real story. And in fact, the press missed the whole financial, or many of them missed. Anya has written about this separately. People who, Michael Hudson, there's this one guy out who was in the Carolinas, right? Or no, who just did his own investigations because they were hearing of all the cheating going on in the mortgages, the loans that were being made. And so is that creating news if you're actually reporting on industry-wide practices that seem to violate the law? I don't know.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is the people in the industry at that time would have accused him of creating news. They say,
right,
you found the 4 exceptions, or you found the few exceptions. And his answer would have been, look at, he did a broad scale investigation, and it was remarkable of what a large fraction of the instances where he investigated were flawed in this particular way. And now, after the crisis, we realize that it was really a prevalent pattern that he had helped uncover.
Of course, another example is the Iraq War, where the press generally did a very poor job in reporting on the reasons that the U.S., the claims are being made, the famous Colin Powell speech. And afterwards, people said, where were you guys? You know, so many people feel the press really can save. Imagine if somehow we'd kept out of Iraq, where we'd be today.
But that actually, you know, it illustrates another example of an area where it's very difficult to do investigative journalism, but could have helped, which was when the war began, the administration said, Rumsfeld said, it was going to cost $60 billion. And, you know, it was going to be just a little bit of an excursion, cost a, by the end of the war, we were spending that every month or two.
Right. Well, Joe wrote a book that, what was the original title of your book? It changed, right?
Well,
The $3 trillion.
It was $3 trillion, but originally it was even less, right? You had
no,
to
it
raise.
was $5 trillion was the real number, but they thought that nobody would believe it if
Joe
it was
wrote a
$5
book
trillion.
about the cost of the war.
And you were quite conservative and very careful, you and Linda Bilmes, and the New York Times still said, oh, those numbers are wildly exaggerated.
They didn't
And of course
review it,
the
right?
war was much more, they didn't review it, and then the war was much more expensive than you had
That's
estimated.
right. I mean, just one part, the amount that we've spent for disability and health care is now expected to be over $1 trillion, just that little part.
The question I have about that is, has our economy absorbed that? I mean, people in talking about our economic problems never talk about the cost of the Iraq War. So what is the impact ultimately of $3 trillion?
Well, one of the things that we said, and where it does show up, is everybody worries about the debt and deficit, and it's all there in those debt numbers. So we finance the war on the credit card, and when you do that, it shows up in the debt, and now people who are, I believe, excessively worried about the debt don't think about how it got there and just say, okay, now we can't spend money.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we're nearing the end. This is out of protocol, but does anybody from the audience want to ask a question? Can take one. Going once, going twice. All right. Okay, one last question.
Right there.
Go ahead.
It bothers me that this man who ran Countrywide hasn't really been punished.
Mozilla.
Mozilla.
Paid $60 million. Now the government's going to sue him for some more money. That man caused so much pain and suffering.
Well, it's not only him. If you look across the financial sector as a whole, the number of CEOs, CFOs who have, for whom there's been any real accountability has been minuscule. A few people in the middle have been punished, but not the people at the top. When things were good, they were willing to take credit and say, that's why we give us $100 million bonus, because we're responsible for the success. But, you know, then it's a famous expression, what is it? Success has 100 mothers, but failure has no one.
Is an orphan.
Is an orphan. So they all closed their eyes and said, we had nothing to do with it. The problem in part is our judicial system. You know, let me just, there's a little bit going beyond. You know, in my mind, one of the most outrageous examples of this was the robo-signing, where the banks were engaged in systematically lying to the court, signing an affidavit that they'd looked at the records. They hadn't looked at the records. And you would have thought, you know, lying to the court once is a serious offense. Lying to the court thousands of times with consequences for real people would be a really serious crime. No one's been held accountable. And that seems to me one of, you know, is a real failure. Now, in the case of particular individuals that you mentioned, one of the problems, we created a legal system where you might say the scales of justice are imbalanced, because what we do is we constrain the budget of the prosecutor, but we don't constrain the budget of the guys who made all this money. So the government's trying to decide how much money to prosecute, what evidence. You know, there's always questions of standards of evidence. And you can make a trial cost huge amounts of money. In that particular case, they did bring it to trial, and I think they failed.
Isn't the political climate, though, ultimately an even bigger...
Oh, it is. And as I say, what's remarkable is the number of prosecutions that they've even tried. His was a case where they tried and failed, but the number of times they've actually tried has been minuscule.
Okay, very good. Thank you all for listening. Thank Joe.